And we're live. Welcome to episode 27 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm Kevin.
Hi, this is Adrian.
And we'll be your host for this episode, where we ask the question, is the US ready for a major war in Asia? We skirted around this topic in the past, but the questions are becoming increasingly important. Can the US still fight a major war? Does it still possess the industrial base to fuel a prolonged war effort, the political will to put aside partisan differences, and a myriad other factors that need to come together to allow it to prevail? How does this tie into United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, as well as ongoing events in the mainland US right now? Joining us to discuss this topic is Dr. Stephen Metz, a consultant with the Military Studies program at RSIS, who is teaching the Land Power Studies course at the Goh Keng Swee Command and Staff College. From 2020 to 2024, Dr. Metz served as Professor of National Security and Strategy, Director of the Warfighting Culture Project, Academic Director of the flagship National Security Seminar, and a contributing editor for Parameters at the U.S. Army War College. Thanks for joining us today, Steve.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To get the ball rolling, let's turn back the clock a little bit. About 10 years ago, you wrote an article questioning whether the US has lost the ability to fight a major war. In the years since, what do you think is the most likely scenario for American involvement in such a major war, and what would it look like?
Well, when I wrote that article about 10 years ago, there really wasn't a lot of thought about it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. was coming out of its heavy involvement in Iran and Iraq. Before that, we'd had the end of the Cold War, and no one had been thinking about kind of big war. But what was leading to that to change in the United States was there was a growing recognition that the United States, once it downgraded its involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, needed to shift back to what was called great power competition. The idea was that for the first time since the early 1990s, that was really the primary dynamic of the international system. And great power competition implies at least the ability to fight a large, even a protracted war. So, I kind of threw out some initial ideas at the time. Since then, that's become something of an intellectual growth industry. Mm-hmm. As great power competition has intensified, both between the U.S. and China and with Russia and Europe, a number of people have been thinking about that. And as you indicated there, the thinking kind of falls into two categories. One is the national will there. Would the national will be there if there was ever another crisis? And the other is whether the industrial base and mobilization capability would be there to fight it. And kind of the short answer is right now, we don't know, but there are people thinking about it, and those people see a lot more challenges than things to be optimistic about. Right?
Yes, Steve. You mentioned Russia. Russia is now in its third year in its war with Ukraine. What do you think are some of the lessons the U.S. military is taking from the war in Ukraine?
Wow, that talk about a growth industry. The lessons of Ukraine is a huge one. I suspect. If you Google the military lessons of Ukraine now, your computer would probably blow up. And I have colleagues that are focusing on strictly that. Mm-hmm. And the answer is that there are many at many different levels. There certainly are a number of tactical ones focused on the evolution of close combat in this environment, the use of drones. I think another big lesson that people really around the world are drawing from that conflict is the growing importance of the narrative domain in conflict, which is kind of a theme that I've really emphasized in my own writing and speaking. And there is kind of a general questioning of the utility of conventional force as new technology is giving even nations like Ukraine long-range power projection, as we saw just in recent events with the drone strikes on the Russian bases. Mm-hmm. And I think another kind of strategic lesson there is that many of the nations that border on Russia are recognizing the importance of configuring their own security to make themselves a harder target for conventional aggression. So we're seeing a lot of stuff go on in like the Baltic states and somewhat in Finland in terms of how can a nation make itself as hard a target as possible for an invasion. And that's something that had kind of fallen out of favor in strategic and security thinking the past couple of decades, but it's now being reinvented. I mean, just things like partisan war, people in arms, and things like that.
Yeah, that's certainly true, Steve, because if we're comparing, for example, the conflicts of the late 20th century, the First Gulf War, and what we're seeing in Ukraine, it's vastly different. But like you also mentioned, if we're looking at how countries are beefing up their defenses, Traditionally, I'd say for the past 2 decades, one of the ways countries have tried to put themselves in a better position to defend themselves has been alliances, especially involving the US if they're in Western Europe. But nowadays, well, NATO has seen better days, let's say that much. How would you say the second Trump administration and their different stance towards Western European allies has affected this kind of equation and how countries are approaching this topic of defending themselves against an adversary?
That's a very astute point, because at the kind of strategic level, one of the lessons that many countries may draw is that even if they're attacked by an aggressor, even if they are a democracy, then they might not be able to count on the United States the way that they felt that they could have in the 1990s or earlier than that. To me, the big question is to whether the Trump policy of let's say lukewarm support for Ukraine really signals a permanent change in the way the U.S. looks at assisting democratic allies and beleaguered democratic states around the world, or whether this is just simply a temporary thing. And, after the Trump administration, whether things will sort of return to the way they were before. And I think NATO is also kind of looking at that. And NATO, I believe right now doesn't know whether this really is a sea change, a difference in history, that they need to move forward with being able to count less on U.S. support, or whether this is just simply a temporary thing and eventually things will return. And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think what may determine that is the outcome of the 2028 presidential election in the United States, to see whether the Trump revolution is permanent, institutionalized, or whether it was just simply a temporary deviation from America's traditional foreign and policy and statecraft.
Adrian, anything to add on?
Yes, Steve, if you wouldn't mind, I would actually like to move our discussion to Asia. How do you see the possibility of major war playing out in the Indo-Pacific theater, which is very different really from what is occurring in Europe?
Oh, absolutely. In the Asia Pacific, you have a number of different operational concepts that the military is looking at, a greater emphasis on multi-domain operations, on dispersed over-the-shore logistics and things like that. But I think in terms of a major war in Asia, if I can kind of summarize what the thinking is among American defense scholars, of course, and obviously the scenario that's most often discussed is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I mean, that is the one that's war gamed, that's studied, and so forth. And there are kind of two big unknowns when they do that. One is the public will part of it. If the U.S. was ever attacked again in the future, I think there would be little doubt that the public would rally behind it, that there would be public will there. But if you kind of do a historical analogy there, imagine in 1941, Japan had attacked the Philippines, but not Pearl Harbor. Would the U.S. have really been able to mobilize for large-scale war there? So in terms of a Taiwan invasion, I think that if China committed aggression against Taiwan, and let's hope they never do, but if they did, but they didn't strike American targets, I think it would be difficult, maybe not impossible, but difficult for an American president to make the kind of commitment that's necessary. The other part of that scenario in the Asia Pacific is the defense industrial base part of it. Because as we all know, the U.S., like China itself, has relatively limited supplies of the very high-tech, exquisite weapons systems that it really bases its warfighting capabilities on today. So as many, many analysts have pointed out, if there ever was a major protracted war between the U.S. and China, it would be very different by month 4 or 5 than it would have been in month 1 or 2. Month 1 or 2, we have all of the long-range, high-tech stuff being used. But once that's used up, it would take really both sides quite a bit of time to build up the capacity to rebuild that. It might even be impossible to do so because a lot of the components for the high-tech weaponry come from globalized sources. So both sides, as they tried to rebuild their stockpiles, would face issues of perhaps not being able to get the circuits, the rare earth minerals, or whatever they needed to rebuild their weaponry. So in a lot of the scenarios about that, is people kind of envision that as a two-phase war. You've got the really high-tech, long-range part for the first couple of months, and then both sides devolve to an older style of war with equipment and methods that could be reconstituted and rebuilt and restocked more quickly.
I was wondering if you could follow up on your assessment on right? So the U.S. efforts to reinvigorate its industrial base, right? So there is a lot of discussion about deficiencies in the U.S. industrial base. I was just wondering if right, you could give our listeners a sense of what are some of the problems you see there, and efforts made by both the Biden administration and the Trump administration in trying to address some of these problems.
Sure. This has been an item of discussion for a few years now. I'll try to hit a few of the key points, but if any listeners are particularly interested in this, what I would point you to is the 2022 National Defense Industrial Strategy. That did come out of the Biden administration. How much of it the Trump administration will continue is hard to say. The Trump administration has said it's committed to rebuilding the defense industrial base, but so far that's just a statement. But when people looked at that capacity, they focused on a number of things. One is that in businesses in general around the world over the past 30, 40 years, the movement has been toward just enough capacity and just in time delivery of things. That's the way that a business operates efficiently. In order to operate efficiently, the defense industry in the U.S. has moved to that same sort of thing. Now, when you're in a non-crisis, a non-wartime situation, that makes sense. It helps keep costs down. But when you're in a wartime situation where redundancy, where having an oversupply can actually be a good thing, this tendency of just in time, just enough might not be enough. Another problem that both the Biden and the Trump administration have pointed out is just the torturous nature of defense contracting in the United States. It's a very, very awkward process. The problem is that by the time a contract gets in place, it may already be obsolete because the world is changing so quickly. So there are people thinking about ways to streamline that. And it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about the defense industrial base in the United States, it's kind of changing because traditionally there have been a number of what are usually called prime defense contractors that produce really, really big, very, very expensive, complex systems. And they've been doing defense contracting for a long time. They really knew how to do it. But in today's world, there's more and more things that defense industry needs. That's from things like small companies, tech startups, a lot of stuff moving over from the commercial sector. And kind of the problem is that the U.S. system for contracting and building the industrial base is really still focused on these big prime contractors that have been around for a long time. So there are a number of efforts to try to balance that, to make it so that we have an approach that recognizes that the suppliers now are no longer just the big multi-billion-dollar contractors that have been working with the government for years and are led primarily by former military people, but as a new kind of industry. But just to kind of summarize the things that are being thought about, there are 4 categories in the National Defense Industrial Strategy that I mentioned, things they wanted to do. One is to augment supply chain resiliency. One of the phrases that's become popular there is friend sourcing. And that means that in defense industry, the U.S. might not be able to make or produce everything it needs, but it should at least try to get it from nations that are friendly and that you can count on. The second priority was to augment workforce readiness, because in people as well as in inventory, kind of the byword in business today is as little as possible for as short a term as possible. And that may or may not work in defense industry. The third priority was to make acquisitions more flexible. And the fourth was to strengthen economic deterrence, to provide a way to prevent suppliers from doing things that would interfere with defense production. And again, this is a 2022 document. I think it was a really, really good document. It was kind of led by then Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks. Whether the Trump administration will adopt all or part of that, I don't know. The Trump administration has said it considers improving the defense industrial base important, but the administration is still in its infancy and it hasn't really fleshed that out into an actionable plan.
Thanks, Steve. Some people still assume that the US can just pivot with a snap of a finger to turn from consumer production all the way to defense production, like kind of what was done during World War II. Right. Or even, just grow their army, because at the start of World War II, I believe the comparison was that the US army was smaller than that of Romania's. And then by the end of the war, it was this far more impressive machine. But that's not quite the same anymore, right? It's going to take a lot more effort to train troops to use modern platforms, to work as a squad, and so on and so forth.
No, it's very, very different. At the beginning of World War II, for better or worse, the United States had been in 10 years of economic depression. And what that meant was there was a huge amount of excess industrial capacity. Plus, the way that defense industry armaments and equipment was made then is you could basically take an existing factory or machine shop that was making anything and you could turn it to defense items. So by 1944, every machine shop and industrial facility in the U.S. was making defense things. You had companies that were making, refrigerators before the war that were making machine guns. We certainly can't do that today with the technology that goes into systems. And, as you indicated, there's also a problem that the materials that go into them are not like they were in World War II, where, you had steel, aluminum, a few things like that is really all you need. Now there is a need for circuit boards, for memory chips, for rare earth minerals and so forth that can come from many places around the world. So the challenge of ramping up industrial production today is significantly more challenging, but it can be done. I was reading something recently that pointed out that at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think the U.S., if I remember the figure correctly, was producing 8,000 155 millimeter artillery shells a month because Ukraine needed like 8,000 an hour and we wanted to supply them. Now we're up to like hundreds of thousands per month. So it can be done, but that was over a multi-year process. Plus, and this is another dimension of great power war, that was in a U.S. where there was no domestic threat. And what a lot of people point out is in a future major war, the U.S. homeland is going to be a theater of war as well. So you have to think about not only how would the U.S. build the workforce and the industry to build munitions in a future war, but how would you do it while you're under active, at least cyber attack, if not kinetic attack as well?
That does bring me to something related to what I mentioned just now about the building up the army.
Right.
So Secretary Hegseth's been talking a lot about this notion of bringing back the warfighter ethos to the American military. What exactly is he talking about? Did the American military ever lose that warfighter ethos?
In my opinion, no. I'll be perfectly blunt here. The Secretary came to the Department of Defense after a long stint at Fox News in the U.S., and Fox News has a number of themes that it's been developing on over the years. And one of them that you saw over particularly the last 5 or 6 years was that the U.S. military was so consumed with DEI, which stands for diversity, equality, and inclusion, that it had lost its warfighting edge. You could hear, Fox News commentators say that over and over again. You could hear politicians pick up on that. So that was kind of the mantra that a lot of American voters heard, was that the U.S. military could no longer do warfighting because it's focusing so much on DEI. I can tell you, as somebody that worked for the U.S. military for 37 years, I was in that environment. That particular criticism was, and I'll be as diplomatic as possible, was not accurate all along. The reality was that while these Fox News commentators and other commentators were making that charge, the reality was that most American military units, whether they're in garrison, in the field, or whatever, would do 2 or 3 DEI training a year. Most bases would have a DEI advisor that would try to make sure that those issues were handled correctly there. But the idea that somehow the U.S. was no longer focusing on warfighting because it was doing DEI was just utter nonsense. So that's why I don't really understand what the Secretary is saying there. Clearly keeping a warfighting culture is a good thing for any military. It's important. But I really think that the U.S. military was doing fine with that before. And, one thing that the critics would use to level that accusation was they said, the U.S. military can't win wars anymore. They would point to things like Afghanistan. I always thought that was, a completely nonsensical accusation as well. But this charge that was promulgated by particularly the conservative, the right-wing media, really did have a damaging effect because the U.S., of course, has an all-volunteer military. It needs to recruit really high-quality people at a level to sustain itself. And the U.S. military, and particularly the Army, had persistent recruiting problems for the past few years. I've talked to people myself who are like former military that said straight up, I would never let my children go into the military because all the military does anymore is this kind of mushy diversity stuff. Again, that was factually completely false. But a large part of the American public had that image. And so now, the Trump administration spoke to that particular demographic and they picked up on that. So, I guess I would say with the Secretary, fine to say that, do what you can, but it was not really the sort of problem that he and his colleagues at Fox News suggested that it was even before he came to office.
I see. I mean, you mentioned that you talked to your friends who were not very keen on letting the children join the military when it was supposedly focusing on all this DEI stuff.
Yeah.
But do you think Secretary Hegseth's focus on this warfighter ethos might help with recruitment issues going forward?
It may. And the reason for that is that the people in the United States who are most likely to join the military tend to be the kind of demographic that, is politically conservative, that listens to Fox News and stuff like that. So it very well may be that if the secretary comes along and says, okay, we've got rid of all that DEI stuff, we're doing war fighting now, maybe recruitment will have an uptick. And if so, that's good. I mean, it's, the more high quality people that the Army and the other services can get, the better. But because young people who are considering joining the military very often know very little about it, so where they get their impression as to whether this is something they want to do or not would be, first of all, from people they know who served, but also from their parents and from the information they consume. So if they consume information from the part of the information ecosystem that has stressed that, the military has gone soft and all it does is DEI, then you have these 17, 18-year-old men and women who begin to believe that. Maybe since they're hearing something different now, they'll have a more accurate picture of what it actually means to serve.
I see. Thanks.
I was actually going to seg our conversation to LA. So, Steve, what is happening right now back in the US is President Trump has federalized the California National Guard and sent it to LA to assist ICE agents in their immigration crackdowns with opposition from California's governor. I was wondering if you could perhaps explain to our listeners what is going on in terms of what is the role of the National Guard and sort of how presidents can federalize the National Guard for use within the United States.
So a really, really complex issue. I'll give you my own personal opinion. This is not necessarily the ground truth, but this is the way I see it. What I see going on over the past few months is we all know that President Trump campaigned on a platform of immediately deporting all illegal aliens in the United States. And we know there are tens of millions of illegal aliens in the United States, as there have been for years. There actually are fewer now than there were 20 or 30 years ago. So one thing that's kind of perplexed me all along is why President Trump and his supporters see this as an existential crisis now, where it hasn't been throughout most of American history, where things were exactly the same. But anyhow, so President Trump campaigned on that. There were concerns at the time about the economic impact, because I really believe that we're going to see just dire economic problems in the U.S., say, come fall, when there aren't the illegal aliens that work in the agricultural industry and stuff. But whether or not it was a good idea or not, the method that it's been done, to me, is really, really important. Because what the administration has done is this ferocious method of gathering up and deporting illegal aliens. I mean, in the social media places where I hang around, the phrase Gestapo-like has been used. Even if you don't want to go that far, I mean, what we see are immigration agents that have their faces covered. They're not identifying themselves. They don't have badges. They're in full tactical gear, like they're a SWAT team going into an armed city. And they're doing stuff like grabbing illegal aliens who are actually playing within the system, who are coming out of court appearances. They're grabbing children out of school. They've grabbed people and left their children standing there. So they're doing this in a way that's intentionally designed to be as frightening and aggressive as possible. So as a social scientist, kind of the way my brain works is I say, okay, what hypothesis best explains the observable information or data? Okay, so the observable thing we see is this really ferocious, if you want to call it Gestapo-like deportation method. And you kind of go, why are they doing that? And a corollary question there is, just in the last week or two, there is growing resistance to this among people in the United States. And people in the United States, the demonstrations that are underway now in Los Angeles and elsewhere, I don't think were against deportation itself, but were against the way it was being done. It was being done in a way that seemed to be as deliberately cruel as possible. So as the demonstrations arose, I was kind of thinking back on what I know about American history. And it just occurred to me that at any other time in American history, if you had this kind of growing crisis in the country, things were getting bad, there were demonstrations and things like that, a president and all of the president's senior officials would be doing everything they could to try to de-escalate the situation. And that's kind of what police are trained to do. If you have a crisis growing, you de-escalate it. In any other crisis in the past, the U.S. president and his top advisors would be trying to de-escalate. But the Trump administration isn't. From the president to his top advisors, what they're actually doing are making statements that, if anything, are making it even worse. So when I look at these events and I say, why are they doing it this way? Why the cruelty? Why trying to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it? What I'm afraid of, in fact, I'll be quite honest with you, I'm somewhere between terrified and petrified right now, is that the Trump administration is trying to escalate this into an outright conflict. Part of the whole Fox News information ecosystem for the past decades has been based on the theme that America is under attack from the political left. Just said that over and over again. So you have millions of people that believe that. Well, right now, these demonstrations that are responding to this cruel method of crackdown are being used in the right-wing information ecosystem as evidence that what they were saying all along was true, that America is under attack from the left. So the kind of nightmare scenario, and I pray this never happens, is that the president and the administration escalate this to such a crisis. There's so many demonstrations. The demonstrations turn violent, and they use that as an excuse to try to crack down on civil rights, potentially even cancel elections in the future. So I just look at what's going on and I say, why are they doing it this way? And I can't come up with a better explanation other than the fact that they are generally trying to exploit a conflict. But you ask about the military. A couple of things that are important there. The U.S., of course, has a long tradition of being extremely wary in terms of using the military for domestic stability. We have done it in the past, but in part because of a legacy of the period after the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s, where the U.S. military was used to occupy the former Confederate states in the South and try to change them. There is a long-term resistance to that. So we do have a long history of using the military, particularly the National Guard, the reserves, for like natural disasters and things like that. And there have been instances where they've been used in extremis for support to civil authorities for stabilization, like major riots that police forces just can't control. But what's interesting about this instance is when the military has been used in the past for what is called support to civil authority missions, a civil authority asks for them. The governor of a state would come and say, okay, these riots are out of control. Hurricane looting is out of control. I need some help from the National Guard to deal with this. In this particular case, the governor of the state of California has said, we do not need military forces to help with this situation, that the Los Angeles police have it under control. It's not reached a level yet where we need federal intervention. So this is really, as far as I know, the first time, or at least the first time recently, there was an instance in the governor of Arkansas refused to integrate the schools and the federal government, in Little Rock, and the federal government sent in forces to make sure that federal law was followed. But this is the first time where there's no federal laws that's being violated. The forces are not there to implement federal law. And the fact that the president has federalized part of the California National Guard, made it under federal command rather than the governor's command, against the governor's wishes. So this really is an unprecedented situation. And again, I keep coming back to this about, why are they doing this? There's got to be some logical explanation, because events on the ground in Los Angeles do not warrant what the administration is doing right now.
Thanks, Steve.
So, Steve, to follow up on that, for observers here in Asia who, probably aren't all that familiar with the use of the US military, particularly on American soil, between a false alarm and a 5-alarm fire, how alarmed do you think we should be right now?
My answer is that in terms of the actual threat of the demonstrations, it's perfectly manageable. But, I myself am extremely concerned. I guess I'd put me at somewhere around a 3 or 4, just by the absolutely unprecedented events that this administration is taking. I think we're finding out one of the weaknesses of the American system of government is a lot of the restraints on the exercise of particularly presidential power are informal norms. Presidents just didn't do that rather than being written into law or something like that. And even the mechanism to censure a president who violates the law or goes beyond the norms is really, really limited. I mean, the Constitution basically says impeachment by the House of Representatives and removal by Senate is really the only way to censure or control a president who is violating norms. And that's really worked up to this point in our history because we have, I guess, been lucky enough to have presidents that more or less adhere to those norms. I mean, some pushed the limits at times, some, fudged a few things, but generally presidents observed the norms. And I mean, like one of the norms is to not use the military domestically when you didn't have to. So what the United States is grappling with now is what to do when we have a president and an administration that basically does not feel bound by the traditional norm that every predecessor administration has felt bound by.
Well, you mentioned about how in this modern day and age, there's a lot of unprecedented things when it comes to governance and how governments can communicate with their populations as well.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the advent of social media, especially all these short video sites like TikTok, kind of accelerates a lot of the problems when it comes to distrusting government. When it comes to misinformation, it just flies around faster than the truth can spread.
Yep.
And that has implications not only for societal unrest in situations like what's going on in Los Angeles, but also, say, in the event of a conflict. Because the discussion about TikTok being banned has kind of fallen into the background for now, but that would probably be a major issue when it comes to the ability of the US to wage a major war in Asia, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me kind of focus in on the bit about presidential communication. President Trump is the first president ever that absolutely insists on communicating directly with the public or actually with his supporters, and I'll get to that in a minute, directly rather than through the formal process. Because, every administration before this, any presidential statement was worked and discussed, and every agency that had a stake in it would talk about it, and they would massage the words, and it was very, very careful communication designed for a specific purpose. That's not President Trump's style. So he did, from the time he began running for office in 2015, the first time, kind of look to social media as his way to communicate directly to his audience. It first really did that on Twitter. Eventually, Twitter, after he lost the 2020 election, Twitter kind of cut back there. So, of course, the president's supporters created what they call Truth Social, kind of his version of Twitter. And that's what he basically uses for his communication today. But there's something important about that. I left Twitter last year after the election and have moved to a social media platform called Blue Sky. And I've had a number of discussions there just in recent weeks. And there were people that would put screenshots of President Trump's statements on Truth Social, supposedly describing what was going on in Los Angeles. And people would come out and, depending on their own particular perspective, would say, this is completely wrong, it's completely false, this is a lie, what he's saying is happening is not happening. The people that were doing that were kind of, shocked by the fact that a president would be saying untrue things to audience of millions of people. And I went in several times when people posted that and said, you have to understand that when the president makes that statement, he's not speaking to you. He is specifically speaking to his base of supporters. And this is the base of supporters that already are inclined to believe America's under attack from the left, that we have this massive crisis from an open border and millions of illegal aliens. I mean, all of these things that are factually false, but that's all they've heard for years, so they believe it. So that's who he's speaking to. So what I think is important about this is the tendency in the part of the United States throughout most of our history is when presidential candidates run for office, they run as partisans. They represent Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, or whatever. But up until now, every president that I can think of, once they win an election, says, okay, I need to transcend that partisanship now. I need to become the president of the people of the United States rather than of Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. President Trump, for whatever reason, really has not done that. President Trump still looks to, communicates with, and phrases his statements in a way that are specifically designed to appeal to only his base. And he doesn't care that anyone outside of his base doesn't believe it, sees it as false, sees it as incendiary or whatever. So, kind of social media in combination with a highly partisan information ecosystem, has created just a completely different political dynamic in the U.S. than I think has ever existed in the past.
If that's the case then, Steve, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Nope. Keep your fingers crossed for us. It's a dire time for the United States. I really hate to say this, but I'm as worried as I've been in my life. And I've worked in the field of national security for almost my entire life, focused on external enemies. But now I am deeply concerned for the survival of our constitutional democracy. Maybe we'll pull it out, but it remains to be seen.
Well then, thanks for your time, Steve.
Sure.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe and we'll see you again.